Hello and welcome once again to Baked Beans Garage, where a broken squirrel still finds a nut twice a day. This Volvo has most of its pipes, but there's still a few more to put in, so let's get into it. As you may have seen last time, this 1986 Volvo 740 turbo diesel wagon now has ice-cold AC, but what it doesn't have yet is a crankcase ventilation system, any vacuum to boost the brakes or drive the servos in the dash, or an actual intake system and filter. So today I'll be addressing all of that. I'll also lump in the overheat fan because that still needs done. By the end of today I want to have this engine bay 100% done, which will be nice. I'm going to start with the catch can. Here's a little edutainment on why I need that. So if you're here, you probably already know what you're looking at for the most part. Here's your engine, you have your piston, your cylinder, that goes up and down real fast to squeeze the air and the dinosaur juice, make explosions happen and make that go round. Now between your piston and your cylinder walls you have piston rings, and as demonstrated on this here American fossil, those piston rings have gaps. That's because they have to get hot and then cold and grow and then shrink without crashing into each other and exploding. And because of this, you will never have quite the perfect seal between the piston and the cylinder wall. And because of that, you will always have at least a little bit of combustion byproducts leaking down past the piston rings into the crankcase. And of course, because that is combustion pressure, that is going to pressurize your entire crankcase if not vented properly. And also because down here we have a bunch of metal bits spinning around real fast, and if your cam is in the correct location, you also have metal bits up there. There's going to be some oil droplets and vapors and other nastiness floating around in that stuff. Now this poses two problems. First, if this hangs out in here long enough and is allowed to cool and start to condense, you're going to get all that nastiness settling down in your oil, and that will dilute your oil with combustion byproducts, exhaust gases, unburnt fuel, and the like. Furthermore, if that pressure is not evacuated, pressure is just going to build up in here, and all of your oil seals aren't going to like that, and you're going to start to leak from your pan gaskets, your crankshaft main seals, pretty much everywhere. Those seals weren't meant to handle those pressures, so we got to get rid of all that junk. Now, the earliest crankcase ventilation systems were just that, circa early 1900s. They were just vented straight to atmosphere. For demonstration, I will draw what is called a road draft tube, which just goes out somewhere where it's going to get air moving across it, and that slight drop in pressure from the wind moving across it is going to draw all that nastiness out of the crankcase, although not that efficiently. Now this kind of gives us a solution, but it gives us a few problems too. Like if you have quite the dirty engine, you're going to get oil fog out of there. That's going to be gross. If you want to go through water, you might get water up into your crankcase. That's no good. And because those are combustion gases getting out, you're going to have some hydrocarbons and some water vapor and other nastiness in there, what aren't very good for the planet. So to make this system more better, instead of just a crankcase ventilation system, we can use a positive crankcase ventilation system, a PCV system. So in order to actively draw all of this nastiness out of the crankcase, i.e. create a positive ventilation system, we can use a PCV valve. Now, at least in a conventional gasoline engine, we have the throttle plate here. You have your engine sucking on that, creating a low pressure here, so it can modulate how much fuel and air it burns to throttle the engine. That's not important right now. What is important is that this will be a low pressure area, i.e. a vacuum, and we can use that to suck fresh air through the crankcase and then burn all of that garbage in the engine. This eliminates the engine farting out all of its garbage into the engine bay, and also lets the crankcase excrement be managed by whatever other emission control devices you have. Side note, a lot of old school guys will like to delete their PCV systems altogether just because it is technically an emissions device. However, as I am explaining now, it also serves quite the important function keeping the garbage and the sludge out of your engine. If you care to learn about that, but those same guys are also afraid of electronic fuel injection, so they're probably not going to be learning anything new. I have forgotten where I was. Ah yes, PCV valve. Illustrated here just because it was convenient most of the time. It'll be up on top of the cam cover. Without getting too in-depth, it's basically just a little regulator. What allows some of those gases to escape and be sucked into the engine via the vacuum, while somewhere else on the engine you will have a breather, what to suck in fresh air. Now this is a super early system as it is drawn right now. We're just sucking in ambient air and shoving that directly into the intake. Let me reconfigure it to something a little more modern. So now this is vaguely representative of something you'd see in the 80s or the 90s. Now, instead of just drawing in ambient air, we have it drawing filtered air through the MAF or AFM or whatever the ECU is looking at to figure out how much fuel to spray in. And instead of just a straight PCV valve, we now have some type of little canister with baffling in it, what to let that oil vapor condense and cool and drain back into the engine. Now, I have drawn this with just a basic little PCV valve, but that will more than likely be an electronically controlled solenoid, because the computer already knows what the vacuum is, what the temperatures and the pressures, and how to make that burn as cleanly as possible. Oh, you'd also have a catalytic converter. I didn't draw that. Now, even though we are condensing some of that oil and letting it go back into the crankcase, that's still going to be vaguely polluted with those combustion byproducts. So ideally, we could have a separate system altogether to capture that oil vapor and separate it from the engine entirely, which is what a catch can does. Now that we have a catch can, we have an external device what takes all that nonsense from the crankcase and shoves it through a bunch of baffles and other mechanisms what will allow it to expand and cool down and let all of that oil vapor and whatever other garbage might be in there settle out of it into a little can. That is the can part of the catch can. We'll look at exactly what is in there later, but after all that garbage has settled out, or some of it, we will have slightly cleaner air what can then be taken back to the intake. So especially on a modern car, this is useful because the computer won't know the difference. It still sees this tube connected to there. This is all sealed. There's nothing vented to atmosphere. So it'll be happy, and it'll also keep all of the garbage off of your intake valves. Speaking of intake valves, without a catch can, all of that garbage is going to be flowing through your intake, and it's going to build up in your intake runners and on your intake valves. Now, on a car with port injection or a carburetor, you have that fuel flowing in across that intake valve as well. And that fuel will clean off those carbon deposits as it's running. However, modern cars most have direct injection where you don't have the fuel flowing into there. So you just have straight air coming across your intake valves, which makes it even more important to have something getting all that garbage out of your intake air. Now, to that point, new cars obviously don't come with catch cans. That's just a cost-cutting and maintenance-saving measure. People can barely keep up changing their oil. Just imagine having another step. That thing would be overflowing constantly. Now, you may have noticed that not all of this applies to the wagon yet. Let me reconfigure the drawing again. Now, with a diesel engine, we are completely reliant on fuel metering to control the speed of the engine, so we do not have a throttle plate, and we therefore do not have any vacuum. Furthermore, we also have direct injection, so no fuel is going across the intake valve. So we know we want a catch can to help clean that up, but we have no vacuum to vent it to. So what do? The same thing, essentially. You still have air being pulled into the engine. This is always going to be a slightly lower pressure than ambient pressure. So most diesels with a PCV system, it'll just be dumped straight into the intake. It'll work good enough. Now to add another complicating factor. Now, with a turbocharger or some means of forced induction, we cannot rely on the low pressure area right here to draw those gases into the engine. However, this does not change things all that much. We can just dump it there instead. That's still going to be a slightly lower pressure than atmospheric, and it'll make the system work good enough. Also, I have run out of whiteboard, so I had to start thinking with portals. Just use your imagination. Furthermore, we can also get rid of the inlet to the crankcase because I feel like it. Now again, being a diesel, we don't have any source of vacuum, but many cars like to use vacuum for various activities. So a lot of diesels will have some type of mechanically driven vacuum pump, and that can be driven off the cam, off the crank, off an auxiliary shaft. Doesn't really matter, just know that is spinning or going back and forth tied to the engine somehow. Doesn't matter. That is sucking in air to produce a vacuum, so it has to exhaust somewhere. So that will just exhaust directly into the crankcase, providing an inlet for this whole system to work. However, as you will see on the wagon, this is gone, but that doesn't really matter. This low pressure area will still be plenty to draw all of that garbage out of the engine and make it work happy and healthy without blowing seals and without caking the intake with a bunch of nastiness. So, to conclude, you want a catch can to suck all of the garbage out of your crankcase without dumping it into your engine. So I have now reconfigured the drawing to be more representative of what I will be setting up on the wagon. I also forgot to mention with the diesel you can get rid of the PCV valve because there's no vacuum to modulate. That can just be a straight line into the catch can or wherever you're putting it. And then the outline from the catch can will go to the intake in front of the turbo. Let's go make that. And now with your mind enriched, we can meet today's main characters. First we have the catch can itself. Here's another cam cover that I have. I will need to interfere with it to have somewhere to plug that guy in. Over here is some stuff to make some vacuum to boost the brakes. Over here is some stuff to make the intake work, also there. But we will meet those guys later. I will begin with the catch can. So here is Volvo's factory solution to the crankcase ventilation problem. It is right up here on the cam cover because this is just a little canister which going to have some baffling in it, and that lets the oil swirl around and cool down a little bit and hopefully condense a little bit before it drains back into the engine. And the other side of that goes here to the turbo snout. Since it's a diesel, we don't have any vacuum to deal with, so there's no valve or anything. That breather just goes straight into the intake. This is super simple and it works, but I don't really like how that looks. It's kind of ugly. Plus the catch can's going to work better anyways. Now I have another cam cover for the other engine that I will be modifying a bit to make that all work. So here's the catch can I'll be using. It's just a generic guy from somewhere on the internet. If we open this guy up, we will see what it does to get that vapor out of the air. So not all that much, just a little baffle plate and a little metallic filter element and little deflectors there for the in port. This guy has two ins. I'm only going to use one. An out in the center, or that plug can come out and that can be the out. I will see what I will do with that yet, but to get it from the crankcase to here to begin with, I'm going to add a bung to my cam cover so I can run a hose straight off there. And then I have decided I will mount this right here next to the receiver dryer. That will make it serviceable, and it also keeps the cylinders next to each other. That also means I get to take apart and re-ruin the receiver dryer bracket that I put so much effort into making look pretty. But no matter, let us get to the metal work. Now if you're up to date on your Baked Beans Garage lore, you will recognize this cam cover from the very first video. Well, first Canon video, not first video. But through the 144p resolution of the camera I was using at the time, you may recognize this as the original one that came on the car. And underneath here we can see that in addition to that little doohickey on top, there is some baffling in there. That can stay, it's not going to hurt anything, but we still have this hole and this little strain relief bracket. Those both need to go away, so I'll just make a little patch for that, grind off those two spot welds, and then back here, that's as good a place as any for a bung. Conveniently, from taking apart some AC lines last time, I have this little mild steel bit of tubing, conveniently with a flange on one end that'll just go in there and weld it from behind. And TIG welding this would certainly be the prettier option, but I don't have the argon or the talent to do that right now. So the old hot metal booger blaster it is. So I even managed to get the right angle that I wanted there. Now, of course, welding on a stamped steel piece, what needs to be flat like this, some warpage is unavoidable, but that is why we have the two plates that go down either side of this. That's what actually holds it to the head and keeps it sealed, so that shouldn't be an issue. It's only a little not square. Anyways, to give this the most durable finish I can, I'm gonna bead blast it and then use this appliance epoxy. It seems to set up real nice and hard and last a long time. Now, of course, being an engine part, we don't want all those granules getting into the oil, so I'm gonna have to rinse this out extremely thoroughly after that, but it should work good. So I ended up hand sanding it with some 400 grit just to make it extra smooth, and used some JB Weld here as filler because there was a little whoop-de-doo. Now before I spray it, I'm going to preheat it with the torch. This does a few things. This will not only burn off any skin oils on there, it will also heat the metal to open up the pores to really suck the paint in. And thirdly, it will sweat out any of the moisture trapped in the surface, and you'll see that water briefly condense before it flashes off, just like that. I have been asked if I'm using heat-activated paint when I do this. I am not. It is regular. Also, getting the can warm helps it atomize a little nicer and gives you a little less orange peel, but telling you to do that with the torch seems like a liability, so just use your noodle. Per usual, tack coat first. Give that a couple minutes to flash off, and then 2 or 3 medium wet coats. The important thing is to get each new coat to flow into the last one so it's real nice and shiny and glossy. I briefly stopped to wonder why I bothered with the filler right here while there's still visible pitting on this end, but then I stopped wondering. And with that drying, it's time to find out how many nuts I'm going to drop into the black hole between the head and the intake here. If you'll remember, I gave this one a 0 effort rattle can when I put the engine together just so it could be complete. It is full of paint defects. Apparently there is another black hole. If you don't have one of these, invest. And if you'll remember the hard lines I made for the coolant, that does complicate things slightly, but I had to take this guy off to reconfigure them so the intake will fit later. And as with any engine with a 2-piece cork gasket like this, they do enjoy a little bit of silicone right at the corner here. I didn't do this earlier because this was still a temp install, but this will be staying on this time. And of course I had to paint up these sticks too. I don't know what their actual name is, but the curvy uppy bits go towards the front and the rear. And a relatively important consideration when you're doing custom work, like this valve cover and this coolant crossover pipe, you want to make sure that it is possible to install. Yeah, I knew what I was doing the whole time. And magnetic socket insert, what for keeping track of the nuts. So here's what I came up with to mount the catch can. It's just the included bracket grafted into the receiver dryer bracket. I have also built up a little gusset with some weld because that's quite a lot of mass to be just cantilevered off that little bit of stamped steel. And I can already feel these little 2mm screws rattling loose. So some red Loctite, just so I hate myself when I have to take it apart. And again, that's a lot of weight to be cantilevered right off of here. I think I'm going to brace it down here somewhere. We'll do that later. So I have decided to regroup and re-engineer. I already didn't like that there were only 2 screws holding this on, but that also blocked the angle I wanted. So I decided to drill and tap new holes. So now that I have broken a tap off in there, I have had to change the angle again, so that is covered up by the bracket. But no matter, it is finally ready enough to go on. Also some shiny new stainless hardware that I believe to have come from an HPI Savage. And now for the real reason I put the catch can here, this bit of tube. I think this is some of the old crossover tube for the oil cooler, but it'll look nice and factory right there. So I'm pretty pleased with that. You may have noticed I intentionally left that fitting not flared and just a straight tube. That way, hopefully, if the catch can ever gets plugged up for some reason, instead of the crankcase just pressurizing and then blowing out, probably the rear main seal, because that's the most inconvenient, it'll just pop that off. So an engineered weak point and some big zip ties just to make it look nice. We'll figure out the rest of those fittings in a little while, but for now we know we need to run that to the intake in front of the turbo, where there is currently nothing, so let us address that. So a word on intakes. Of course, cooler air is denser, and there's a lot of hot air in the engine bay, so we want to suck the air from outside of the engine bay, especially because we want all 124 horsepower of unbridled fury from the D24T. So a cold air intake is ideal. Hearing cold air intake, you may think of one of these dingalings. Luckily, I am an adult and I'm not putting a pod filter on an engine that probably won't even make 150 horsepower. These can be great if you're doing mods and your engine stands to suck more air than factory. Obviously, that's not a problem here. And I would like this engine bay to be a little more sophisticated. Now, since the late 70s, early 80s, good cars at least, have for the most part come with cold air intakes, although they might have some muffling qualities where you can't hear your turbo or your induction noise. Another reason this might work for you. Just don't lie to yourself and think you're gonna make power just by slapping on a $80 cold air intake from eBay. So at least in North America, all 740s had a cold air intake. They suck from this little hole in the fender well here. And conveniently, a diesel and a 740 gas or turbo used the same lower airbox at least. Here I have the airbox lid from a red block turbo, chosen of course because it says turbo on there, plus 5 horsepower. But of course, this needs some light lobotomization before it can work. So making this airbox work is going to be quite simple. Obviously, it's already meant to mount into the car. Of course, in a 740 turbo, you'd have a MAF right here. We don't need that, obviously. We just need a pipe down to the turbo. These silicone couplers you can get anywhere on the internet make that quite easy. And using the leftovers from the intercooler kit, I have fabric-cobbled this little dealio from a 180-degree elbow that I didn't use. Of course, we still need to plug in the catch can line, but we'll deal with that later. For right now, this needs both cleaned up and some light modifications. Fun fact, I also discovered that these little clips are the same that you'd find on a 240, which is where 4 of them came from. And of course, this will also let us use an off-the-shelf filter element, which makes service in the future quite a lot easier. However, one complication, this had this little bracket here somewhere. I don't know, I'm assuming that mounted the MAF. I don't need that. We'll plug up those holes with something very typical for the era. We have a little thermostatic valve here. This pipe would go to a muff around the exhaust, what for on a real cold day. That's where the hottest air is going to be the soonest, so it can draw in some hot air for emissions and also for warming up. That's going to go away. Of course, we don't even have an exhaust muff anymore, and there's enough going on in the engine bay. There's also this trumpet on the inlet side, which I think is going to be the biggest restriction anywhere in the system, so I might pop that out. Much like a velocity stack, that just helps smooth the airflow out, but with everything going on in here, I can't imagine how that laminar flow would stay at all laminar. No matter, I'm just going to clean this up and maybe take it apart and see what I figure out to make that stay there. I have inadvertently found a material that this oscillating tool can actually handle. Didn't expect that. Junk. So this is the little plate what held the hinge valve assembly thingy. Don't need any of that anymore. And I think I'm just going to block off that hole from the outside. So this can continue to live down here, just closing off the bottom of the box. I have an idea. This is another coolant jug cap from when I got it running, that the innards of it kind of did that. I don't know, no matter. That's about the right size, and it says Volvo. I think with 2 self-tapping screws and a little foam gasket, that's a nice OEM looking solution. Of course, no one's ever going to see that, but I'm quite proud of it. It's the little touches. And to finish this off, I have a bog standard element from Wix. And as for the unused holes in the lid, I just raided my box of random plastic fasteners and found 2 little plastic rivets what work quite nicely. And since they're downstream of the air filter, I added some super glue just to make sure they stay there. And to get it back in the car, it's just 1 bolt through this little bracket that goes on the frame rail. Surely that can't become a headache. So this only mounts with the one screw right here. On the back it is supported by a little rubber footsie. What just rests on the fender well, so I have put a little square of anti-chafing tape to protect my paint. Now to plug it into the turbo, I have just made this up out of a leftover 180-degree bend from the intercooler kit. In place of the MAF on the airbox, I have a generic silicone coupler. I think from 75 down to 65 millimeters, 68. I forget, just search it on eBay and you'll find what you need. No beads on these except for down at the turbo, because of course this will only be atmospheric pressure. Now to get the catch can plugged into that, whenever I need a hose that is not straight, I just like to go to the salvage yard and look around. This is a power steering return hose from a 2005 Volvo XC90. Of course, I'm a big fan of it saying Volvo, so that's nice. I have added some marine heat shrink on here because the nipple was a little smaller than I needed it to be. And to plug this into there, I will need to get a bit creative. I have come up with a bit of an unorthodox solution for this, in the interest of keeping it modular and changeable later, also in the interest of keeping my ugly TIG beads off of it. I had the idea to use the coupler as a gasket and then hog out the nipple from the original turbo snoot, shave that down a touch, and then just have it in there like so. And then on each end of this, I have notched it so that can breathe. And that works pretty nicely. Also for the bead at the turbo end, I know I have mentioned before, an easy way to DIY it yourself is to get a pair of dikes, what have a little crimper section in the middle, and just lop off the cutty bits. And then you can both work on your carpal tunnel and work on making beads. Very simple and cheap. And to the astonishment of no one, I have rated several Volvos, so I have a set of OEM intake hose clamps. Then of course, blasted and painted, so they're pretty. And my only concern is that the chafing between the two pieces of aluminum will become an issue, but we are sure to find out. And now we arrive at the final form of the intake and PCV system. I'm quite happy with it. I suppose this hose here could have been straight for the most part, but I think the little whoop-de-doo gives it some purpose. I like it. To recap all of the plumbing that was done, that hose there is what remains of the coolant crossover pipe for the oil cooler down there. This guy, XC90 power steering return hose. Off the shelf catch can, we have the unused ports plugged up there and there. I added a little holdy-any bit down there so that's not rattling back and forth with vibrations so it doesn't crack right there. The intake, again, just off-the-shelf stuff. The reducer down at the turbo snout is a bit of an oddball size. It is 2.35 to 2.5, about 60 to 63 millimeters. 2.5 inch all the way up to here, where in place of a 740 turbo MAF, we have a 70 to 63 millimeter reducer. And of course, I had to go through the trouble of painting those clamps. So that wraps up this side of the engine bay. Now we just need some vacuum for working the power brakes and the servos in the dash. So of course this engine originally had a mechanical vacuum pump. If you've been following this project, you know that I have now deleted that. So here I have some bits that will help me reinstate some vacuum. So in the interest of reliability and safety, it is always best to stick with OEM if you can. Conveniently, many Volvos from the late 90s through mid-2000s, maybe even later, had an auxiliary vacuum pump on the turbo models, and maybe some others. What in case you're not making vacuum and you still want boosted brakes? For safety, of course. So here I have all the bits that make that system work. First and foremost, the vacuum pump itself. Now this is a fairly common mod for older diesels, engine swaps, even EV conversions, where you want to keep your vacuum boosted brakes, but you no longer have a vacuum source from an engine. Now to turn this guy on and off, Volvo has a bespoke check valve and pressure switch device. Here's the part number on this one. It's for a V70 or something. I don't know. There's a few different flavors. Like here, I have the one from a XC90. It does the same thing. The tubes just come out at different angles. Speaking of XC90, I have gone to a salvage yard and raided one of those, to get the pump mounting bracket and the connectors for these two things. And finally, to control it, a relay. We'll talk about the wires later. But so we have context for what we're looking at here, let us go to the whiteboard and see why vacuum is important and why I don't have it yet. Okay, don't worry, this will be quick. Here I have drawn a very simplified, typical vacuum diagram, what you might find in a car from the 80s through the early-ish 2000s. Up here is your brake booster. This is just a big servo motor that uses the negative vacuum pressure. There's a big diaphragm or piston, some valving in there. What takes a signal from your foot via the brake pedal uses that vacuum energy to suck a big piston this way when you push on it, and that makes your brakes more stronger. Doesn't matter for our purposes what's going on in there. Down here is the HVAC box. This has a bunch of little vacuum servo motors, what's controlled by your HVAC controls. That opens and closes your blending doors, picks where the air goes. Again, not too important, just that it needs vacuum. As we discussed earlier, at least a gasoline engine makes its own vacuum, so we just tap into that. That's going to the intake, you can't tell. And over here is a check valve that just lets air only flow this way, so the engine can only suck and stuff from the engine can't make its way back into these parts. Now, what you may or may not have is a vacuum reservoir, which is just an empty tank, an accumulator of sorts. Because a gasoline engine isn't always making constant vacuum at higher throttle settings, higher load settings, that vacuum is going to drop off. And that gives these bits something to use before you come back to idle or whatever. And that may plug in before or after the check valve. Again, not important. Fun anecdote, I built a Mark II Jetta with no vacuum reservoir. The AC worked really nice until I matted the throttle, and then that vacuum fell off, and then all the blending doors in the HVAC box would close. That's how I learned that's important. Pretty nifty. I don't think there was a check valve either. That would have helped. No matter, I will now redo the drawing to be representative of what I'm going to make in the car. So much like the newer Volvo that these parts came out of, we now have the electric vacuum pump, the pressure switch, and I have also added the check valve to the front of the brake booster. That is a very common arrangement, and that is what is in the wagon at the moment. Here is another check valve just for convenience, because I found one in the parts bin that's going to let me plumb that in quite easily. Now again, the car this stuff would have came in is a turbo gasser, so we have another port on the pressure switch. That would have gone to the intake manifold. And here is also another check valve. You can think of it as a shuttle valve. It's just going to port to the master cylinder, whichever one of these has a stronger vacuum, be it the electric pump or the engine. Also built into here is a pressure switch, which electrically cuts on the vacuum pump whenever this vacuum falls below a certain threshold. I don't know what it is, doesn't really matter. I just know it's enough to run the brake booster, so it'll all be good. So let us go get that mounted and then that plumbed, and then we'll throw some wires into it. So in shopping for some real estate to get this guy mounted, I find this nice cavernous area in front of the battery to be quite convenient. Again, I have harvested a bracket from a 2004 XC90, I believe. It's tucked in there right behind the headlight. I think if I just lop that tang off, there is a nice convenient flat area here to zip that into. That will put the pump vaguely there. I'm not sure if it matters what orientation these guys live in, but that's how it's mounted in the original car, so I'm going to keep with that. Furthermore, this area has a lot of other stuff I need, like I can tap my 12 volts off of the circus breaker for the amp back here. There's a grounding block right up in here, and it'll be super easy to run a vacuum line right up over the apron. So let us hack and slash this until it fits. Surprising to no one, I have changed my mind almost immediately. The outlet, or inlet, I guess, of the pump would crash into the battery tray down there. So it's going to go on this apron here instead. Makes it a little simpler. I don't think it'll interfere with anything. I'm sure we'll find out later. I'm quite happy with how that looks, and now after taking the battery in and out 37,000 times, here is where I have landed. Now at that XC90, I took a bunch of other preformed hoses that I found. This one was somewhere in the vacuum system as well, and I cut this little elbow out of it. I think it'll work best because, of course, it says Volvo. And while it may look precariously close to the battery, I promise it does fit. And Volvo originally used a soft hose going up to the brake booster, so I am confident in also doing that. And I think that is a nice place for that to live. You may be concerned that it is precariously close to the battery, but worry not, it does fit. I also made this little angly piece to keep the battery from crashing into it this way. And that battery tray being fiberglass reinforced plastic, that makes using self-tapping screws quite easy. Fun fact, 1986 was the first year for the plastic battery tray and the last year for the D24T in the US. So if you're in the US and you see a D24T 740 with a plastic battery tray, you know it's an 86. And finally, to make it work, I just have an off-the-shelf relay and socket, what has a fuse built right into it, and that saves some complexity. I'm just going to throw it right there on its side. Now, being a cheapo relay socket, of course, it was not weatherproofed in any way. And of course, there will be moisture up here, so I have slathered the back of it with silicone, and I will also come up with some kind of gasket, what to keep that sealed up between the relay itself and the base. But first, I will draw one final picture to show how the electrons are going to dance around and make the pump work. So of course this is a very simple relay controlled circuit. All I need is a switched 12 volt from the ignition, a hot 12 volt from the battery, and that will feed the relay controlled by the vacuum switch to drive the pump. The switched 12 volt I'm going to take from the altitude compensator switch up on the strut tower. The hot 12 volt I conveniently have my circuit breaker for the audio system right here, so I can just tap off that ring terminal, and then I also have a grounding block right up here to run my grounds to. Now we will see it may be more convenient to have the vacuum switch on the ground side of the relay control circuit. No matter, I'm just going to build up a separate little harness what to occupy this corner and connect all of those thingies. And with my salvaged connectors, I will just start zip tying things in to see roughly how I want to route all that. So I have now made this, save for the switched 12 volt wire, which I'm just going to stick on the terminal. So if we reintroduce an electron cube, we can see if it's going to do anything, or just let the smoke out. You also may have noticed the feed wire is not fused in any way, so I gave it its own conduit just to try to keep the smoke in going forward. That's a sick beat and all, but I don't think it's supposed to be doing that. Perhaps a leak somewhere? Oh, I forgot to mention, it is plugged into the master. Like I said, I do have the check valve on the front of the master, but I have also added another check valve that I think is from a Mark III Jetta. I don't know, some flavor of Volkswagen. I don't need it to be a check valve, I just used it as a tease so I could plug in the line what goes to the HVAC. Oh, the HVAC. The heater valve is not plugged in, I wonder. So I have the heater set to full cold right now. I was to assume that that valve got vacuum when you set it to hot, but it may be backwards. So let me put it to hot. Perhaps no. Oh, perhaps yes? I don't know. I still don't like how it's cycling before it cuts off like that. Mayhaps need a vacuum reservoir? I don't know. Let's see if the brakes are boosted. That seems to work good. Another thing I did not mention, I didn't put a vacuum reservoir in, and I also used a hose because that is what the XC90 had. So if it's good enough for Volvo OEM, it's probably good enough here. And we can also see if some of these blending doors are going to work. There's some stuff that should move. That points the air at your feet or your face. There it is. Can hear some wind moving around in the pump cycling. And there is the recirculate valve, what picks recirculate or fresh air. Feel like that should be faster, but I'll take it. Ooh, hey, a dome light. I forgot that some of this car works. Obviously, I won't know till I actually drive it, but those appear to be boosted. And as mentioned, we have the check valve on the front of the Master here, but I also added this check valve. I think it's from a Mark III Jetta. I don't know, it doesn't matter. I'm just using it as a T to plug in the line that goes back to the HVAC valve body. And here's that heater valve line that was not plugged in. Now that is plugged in, we can see if it will do anything. Hey, it did something. Lovely. I think I'm gonna let it sit like that for a while to see how often the pump clicks on. I think that's close enough to a leak check for my standards. Ah! There may be a leak. Also worth mentioning, these originally have a little valve right here, what makes you wait till the coolant's warm before you can turn the heater core on. Hush. As you can see, that was broken, so I omitted it when I made those new lines. But now we know everything works electrically, so I can tidy all that up and then hook this where it needs to go. I'm going to jump it right into the altitude compensation switch right here. That is also why I made the wires blue. Color coordination is about 90% of electrical work. So a few considerations I would like to mention. When you're putting wires in your car, especially with a safety adjacent system such as this, take your time, make it look nice. When you take your time and put everything in conduits and wrap up your harnesses and make it real nice and tight and secure, that just means your wires are going to last a long time. If it looks right, it's probably good enough. That, of course, is going by the TLAR principle. That looks about right. Well, maybe not that. That does. Also, I lied. I have another picture. When you're doing soldered butt splices, like I did here, keep in mind that this, your solder joint, that becomes a rigid mass. Here are your wires, those still flex. So especially if this wire is in an area where it needs to move around, you're going to have a big stress riser right there and right there. So firstly, keep these in areas that aren't going to move. And second, use some heat shrink. That'll act as a strain relief and help relieve that big stress riser you have put at the end of that solder joint. This also goes for these crimp terminals, because many of these cheap ones do not have a strain relief built in that clamps onto the insulation. So you also introduce a stress riser right at the end of the metal piece of the terminal. So you can mitigate that for the most part by just adding some heat shrink up over the end of that. That also helps keep the moisture out. And speaking of crimp terminals, these cheap ones you can get at Extortion Auto are decent, some of them. If you do them right and use heat shrink, you can get quite a long time out of them. However, there are a few evil ones in here, like these uninsulated butt splices. Throw these directly in the circular file. Same goes for these knife type wire tapper inner thingies. What pierces the insulation unless you hook one wire to an existing wire? These are trash and will fill all of your junk with corrosion. Now onto the system itself that is now working. As mentioned, I got the switched 12 volt power from the altitude compensator switch right here. I think it's the bottom one. I don't know. That feeds the solenoid on the injection pump. It has switched 12 volts, which now also runs the relay. Speaking of relay, I only just learned that the XC90 didn't have one. So that keeps the big current out of the little switch here, which will probably make it last longer. No matter, it makes it a little more complex, but I think it'll be beefier in the long run. So that could have been a bit simpler, but oh well. So of course, I still have to road test this. There's quite a lot more to do before I can drive this thing on the road, but I think it'll work nice. If this pump ends up cycling while driving more than I would like it to, I will probably add a vacuum canister in this area somewhere. I'll just tee it right off of here and go down into there. I think it might be cycling so much because this is such a long run of hose and there's 2 check valves between this and the brake booster that there ends up being a slightly lower pressure at this end when the pump is running, and then when it cuts off, that all equalizes and then cuts the pump back on. That didn't make sense, but it doesn't really have to. I'll see how it does on the road. I know these things don't like to run continuously very much, so I may see about getting a heat sink to put on that motor, what to mitigate the possibility of it burning up, but we will see. But as it stands right now, this works. There is vacuum. You saw the solenoids in the dash working. The brakes are boosted, I promise. And if you're following the build, that leaves pretty much everything functionally on this car about done. But I did promise a complete engine bay by the end of this episode, so let me address the many more little things that need done in here. A few of which I have already taken care of, as I deemed them a little too boring to want to film. Starting with the boost lines, what go from the back of the intake manifold to the boost compensator on the injection pump, and now to the boost gauge in the cab. A little more complicated by the PCV setup now, but there is the line coming off there. Runs back along the firewall, down to a T in this area somewhere, and then ever so sneakily up past the trans dipstick into the injection pump from there. And the other end of the T goes into the dash through this grommet up here. I could have saved myself some time by putting it through the feed-through grommet down there behind the injection pump, but that was like a year ago. I didn't have any foresight. But no matter, I think it is hidden nicely now under the strut tower brace. Also in this corner, I had yet to feed the hood release cable through. I'm surprised no one has called it out on that video yet, but when I ran the wire for the amp, I used the hole that needs to go for the hood release cable. So now the amp wire has moved over to here, and the hood release cable is where it needs to be. And moving back slightly, we can see that the hood hinge springs are gone. I have now painted those as well as the original hinges to this car, as these are still the parts car hinges, which are all bent out of shape. So those will go on in a minute. I also mentioned the overheat fan up at the front, which has now been introduced. This is just a generic slim 12-inch electric fan mounted to my intercooler bracket down here with 2 little tabs, and then tied directly into the header panel using the tabs included with the fan, although there is not room to get a screw in here. So this one is a zip tie, but it is nice and solid. I don't think it's going to go anywhere. And to verify that it works, of course, I will need some electrons. This is also me remembering I need some kind of battery tie down, maybe later. And key on, of course, the vacuum pump will also remember it exists. It didn't cycle a bunch of times that time. That's nice. And that fan is run by this overheat switch up at the corner of the radiator, so if I jump that, of course I had to offset it a little bit because of the trans cooler on this side, but being a much more modern fan, and I think the original was a 12-inch, that should be more than enough if it is to begin to overheat. So to begin finishing out the engine bay, here's the rest of the hardware that needs prettied up. I don't know what nefarious intentions you might have with the VIN, but please respect the car's privacy. I have censored it. And if you don't know this trick, sticking them all in a piece of cardboard to sand or bead blast and then paint them all at once is by far the easiest way to do it. But some of that stuff goes on the hood itself, so to keep it from bonking my noggin, I will start with the hinges. These I have painted off camera the same Summit carbon fiber metallic single stage urethane. And you may have noticed my wire here replacing the hood spring in the meantime. Really banking on the other hinge supporting the hood while I do this. This could become a headache in more ways than one. And you may remember these nuts were temporary, so I could paint up underneath where the hood hinge sits. Okay, bye. I also love how they have a little, a little tang so you can set it down in there and it will support the hood even without hardware in it. Nice. All right, if it's gonna go left, it's gonna be right here. Ooh, socket too long. We are off to a thunderous start. And while I'm up here putting the little bumper in for the hood, good as time as any to put the VIN plate back on. This is the only place you should ever use pop rivets. I have also done the totally normal thing of digging through my bin of pop rivets to find the two that I thought were the prettiest. Also, the only reason I have kept track of it for these 2 years it's been off the car is because I taped it in a baggie to the wall. And yes, I did touch up the black areas with a Sharpie, because of course I did. And you may notice it's quite shiny. I wiped all this down with some ceramic wax before I put the pieces on. Also, when I'm painting hardware like this, I like to use rattle can because it's thinner and softer and won't tend to chip very aggressively like a real thick, hard urethane will. I'm not entirely sure what this specific plate represents, but it was there, so it shall be again. Fun fact for the unfamiliar, if you rotate this little doohickey thusways, factory 90-degree hood, actually a little further than that. And furthermore, if you leave it like that and go to close the hood, that little ramp piece resets it automatically. That is so deliciously Volvo. And finally, we arrive at a completed engine bay. Actually, okay, now it's done. That's just some chrome pen. I'm not sure if it'll hold up, but we'll see. Some brake clean will take it off, and it'll just be regular if not. Some closing notes. I have introduced a battery strap, just some generic guy down around the tray. And you may have noticed I didn't actually mount the vacuum switch on anything. That's because all the pipes going into it hold it securely enough. Also, the port I didn't use is capped off with a bit of hose and a screw stuck in the other end. I don't like using those cheapo vinyl caps you can get. They tend to dry rot very quickly. And one thing I forgot to mention, well, I didn't forget to mention it, but I forgot to do it. Stuffing your catch can with some steel wool will give that oil vapor more surface area to cool down as it condenses and make it a more effective filter for the crankcase vapors. Here I have some stainless steel wool in ball format. Speaking of cooling, I do realize it's right next to the hot section of the turbo. I will see how yucky it gets in this hose and maybe add some heat shielding if I don't think it's doing its job good enough. Also, being a diesel, you got to keep an eye on this thing because if it starts to overflow, you may, suck oil into the intake and let it run away. So be careful. And yes, I'll have to add a zip tie every time it comes off, but I think that is preferable to the unscheduled disassembly that would be inevitable without this little strain relief. And as long as I perform the ritual, it should last a good long time. That's not going anywhere. And a little note on my convoluted hose routing, you do want bends in your hoses, especially hard lines. That's because that's going to move independently from that and this a little bit as well. And bends like that give it places to flex without putting strain on the fittings, so a consideration. So anyways, it's done, at least under here. I didn't have the foresight before I started taking anything apart like 2 years ago to get some nice establishing pan shots, but I'll put some here if I can find any. Obviously, a ways to go before I can actually drive the thing, but there's quite a lot left to do. Maybe next time I'll at least put it around the yard. Speaking of next time, there is still all of the paint on the whole car that needs cut and buffed, so that's probably where I'll start. In the rest of that video, I will start putting together the rest of the body and all the trim. And then finally, the interior can start to go back together. Obviously, there is not much of that, but there is snack. Point being, there's probably only a few videos left on this car before some road testing and then the big final reveal, so stay tuned. And of course I say it's done under here, but something is sure to go wrong when I start driving the thing, and we'll have to take some stuff apart and make a few tweaks, but we'll get to that. Anyways, I think that's all the mouth noises I wanted to make, so that wraps it up for today. So I do promise that 1 hour long videos are not the new norm for the channel. We just had 2 very dry and tedious videos right back to back. But do let me know if you enjoy that. Maybe I'll try to do more of it. As mentioned, next video we'll start putting the rest of the exterior together to get it looking like a car again. Anyways, as always, if you're still here, I very much appreciate you watching. Please do like and subscribe, maybe share the channel. I'm trying to grow it as much as I can. And you may have noticed my YouTube shorts. I also have a TikTok where I'm doing little short videos on bits of history that I find interesting. So check that out if you are a nerd like me. Anyways, this has been Baked Beans Garage. I am Chinchilla, and I will see you next time.